Hello and welcome to Chapter 7, The Presidency for PA 315. So as we read in the text, this chapter is about the president, and specifically the President of the United States, and how it came about and how the power has expanded over the years. So we'll start out talking about the Electoral College. And as you know, we do vote in a presidential election. However, the way that the vote is tabulated is a bit different. It's not a direct vote. The vote is of the electors for each state, and each state has the number of electors equivalent to the 2 senators for each state plus the number in the House of Representatives. So most states have a winner take all. So if someone wins even by a very small margin, less than a percentage point in a state, the winner will receive all of the electors, all of the electoral votes for that state. Some states, Nebraska, Maine, and some others, do have a more proportional allotment of electors, so they will break it down. However, that's only a handful of cases, and in general, it's winner take all. Due to this, you see an extraordinary advantage for smaller states, and smaller meaning less populated. For example, if we look at the 2016 election, the final vote count, Donald Trump had 62 million, Hillary Clinton had 65 million, and despite a little bit less than 3 million more votes for Hillary Clinton and over 2 percentage points higher, Donald Trump won the presidency because he won the Electoral College vote. And if you look at the Electoral College vote, it was 57% to 43%, which is quite a wide margin of victory. However, in reality, the popular vote, he was not the winner. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened. It has happened in several previous elections. A major election in 2000, of course, this happened. And you will see that generally the reason for this is the advantage given to the less populated states as set forth in the Constitution through the compromise. And once again, remind you to watch the video. It's in Module 4, the Electoral College, and that explains this more in detail. So the President of the United States, as you remember, the first incarnation of the United States of America, we had the Articles of Confederation. And in the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch. So the federal government had very little power, especially the president. We think of George Washington as the first president, but in reality, technically there were 18 presidents prior to George Washington for the United States of America. However, that position was very weak and did not have any of the powers that we associate with the president as set forth in the Constitution, which created the modern form of the United States government. There was a fear of executive power. The people at the time did not want a king. They didn't like the royal governors for the colonies who had a wide range of powers. However, over time, the powers have grown by interpretation of the Constitution. And when we say the congressional powers at the federal level have grown through implied law, when referring to the president, we say inherent properties. So these are not necessarily enumerated, written specifically in the Constitution. However, through interpretation of the Constitution, these inherent powers, similar to implied powers, have given the president's position a chance to grow significantly in power over the last few hundred years. So qualifications for president and vice president must be a natural-born U.S. citizen, must be at least 35 years old, and have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. And you have to understand at the time there was a lot of movement, especially in the wealthier communities, or maybe someone was a United States citizen born to United States citizen parents or was a citizen after the revolution. However, they're working in France or they're working in the UK or somewhere else. They wanted to make sure that the people lived in the US for at least 14 years. And no one has even come close to not satisfying that since the beginning. So the term of office, there was, as you read, there's lots of different thoughts on that, anywhere from 2 years to annual to 11 years. And they eventually agreed upon the 4-year term with an additional term if reelected, but that wasn't mandatory. And there wasn't anything originally saying the president couldn't run for reelection multiple times. However, the first constitutional president, George Washington, did not seek a third term. He felt it was good to have the transfer of power, and the presidents from that time onward mostly prescribed to that rule. Some exceptions were, of course, Ulysses S. Grant, who did try to run for a third term, though he was not successful in running. And then, of course, FDR, Roosevelt, who won 4 terms, dying early on in his 4th term. Because of this, because of the situation with FDR and the 4 terms, the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, and that limited the president to 2 terms or 10 years if they became president due to the death or resignation. And this was set up so that they wouldn't have the same sort of power structure for such a long period of time as it happened with Roosevelt. As we've talked about before, some of the checks on the president are impeachment. And this was advocated by Benjamin Franklin and was thought that was necessary, that there's a way, a check on the presidents. Again, there's this fear of this dictator. And impeachment is voted on in the House, and they vote on the articles of impeachment. They need a simple majority, so over 50% to pass. And then the Senate votes to convict, and the Senate acts as the court. And actually, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over these hearings, as we've seen recently with former President Trump. However, the Senate, to vote to convict, needs 2/3, a supermajority, and that's never happened, and probably never will, due to partisan politics. It's just very difficult to get that level of nonpartisan agreement. Executive privilege, this is not mentioned in the Constitution, but has been used by many presidents from the beginning. And one of the executive privilege contexts is the president may withhold information due to confidentiality or national security. And it's fairly vague until 1974, during the Watergate trial. This is where Nixon was being accused of being the ringleader behind a burglary of the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel or Watergate Office Complex in Washington, D.C. And he was refusing to give over tapes of recorded conversations in the White House and other material. And the Supreme Court at the time restricted executive privilege when it is sufficiently shown that the presidential material is essential to the justice of the case. So they can't just withhold something if they feel, it could be incriminating. If it's essential to the justice of the case, they have to give up the material. And Nixon did turn over tape recordings and documents. However, there was missing material. The 25th Amendment, another check on the presidency. One thing they wanted to make certain, and remember, this is 1967, so this is coming after President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. They wanted to make sure that the president names a vice president in a swift manner, who is then approved by a majority of both the House and the Senate. But this also allowed for the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to deem if the president is unfit to carry out his or her duties, and then a procedure to allow the vice president to become the acting president. And this has been brought up in several cases. It was actually brought up in the last administration. It has been brought up in cases where a president is incapacitated, such as President Wilson. In 1919, he had a stroke and became very incapacitated, paralyzed, section of his body, couldn't speak. And his wife became kind of the conduit with him in the White House, and people felt that that should have gone to the vice president, though it did not at the time. So they felt that this was necessary because of cases like President Wilson, as well as the case with FDR, who died in office, who was very sick in his last year, as well as the assassination of President Kennedy, had he survived in some incapacitated state. They wanted to make sure that there was a way to move through the power structure to make sure that able-bodied individuals were carrying out the roles in government. So the presidential line of succession, this was established in 1947. Again, think of the context. This is after FDR has died in 1945. He was elected, just takes office and then passes away. Vice President Truman becomes president, and they wanted to make sure that it was codified in the law, the succession, the line of succession, because it wasn't mentioned in the Constitution outside of the vice president becoming president. That was mentioned. So this was the line of succession, pretty much as it was agreed to at the time. You have the vice president, and then the Speaker of the House, the President pro tem of the Senate, then Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. And if you look at the different secretaries that they have here, though they have the Attorney General thrown in there as well, they would go on in line of succession per the time that they were added as a department. So for example, in 1947, there was no Secretary of Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, or Homeland Security. These were created later. So each time one is added, they go into the list, albeit much lower. And of course, the chance of any of them becoming president is minuscule, unless you watch certain television shows where they had an explosion in the Capitol during the State of the Union, and then it was an obscure secretary who became president, but that probably will never happen. The constitutional powers of the president, these are the enumerated powers in the Constitution, and you have the appointment power. So the president appoints ambassadors, federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, obviously, cabinet members, and other executive branch positions. And they may appoint as many as 3,500 federal employees, which is more than anyone could really ever do. Otherwise, that would be the only thing they're doing as president. And only 1,125 require Senate confirmation, but still that's over 1,000. That's quite a few. And so there's been discussions that this is a little bit too much. Government has grown too much where the Senate just doesn't have the time to go through all of these different confirmations, as well as it's become very partisan. So the second major power, the power to convene Congress. So Congress must appear before the president if convened. So the president usually does this. The example is the State of the Union, it's usually every year, late January, or during special circumstances. You know, this happened in Pearl Harbor, the attacks of September 11th, etc. The power to make treaties. This is enumerated in the Constitution, and this allows treaties with other nations, but these treaties need to be approved by the Senate in 2/3 of a vote, which is quite a large margin. And most treaties are ratified. I think it's 90% that are. Senate has rejected treaties. One of them was the Treaty of Versailles, and that was after World War I in 1919. They didn't want to create the League of Nations. It was also very partisan. Wilson was a Democrat, was led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a Republican, who were more isolationist. They didn't want the US to be dragged into all these conflicts, which they thought would happen with a League of Nations. The League of Nations actually was put together by President Wilson in the United States. And when all of these other countries signed up for it, and then the country that had put it forth, and Wilson just thought this would be a done deal, the Senate rejected it, and he apparently never recovered, and some say this is associated with his stroke of that year. Eventually, League of Nations did go on. It didn't have much power without the United States as a member, and of course, didn't work too well since you had World War II 20 years later. And then later, of course, became United Nations, which was approved. So constitutional powers of the president, the veto power is very powerful, and this stops a bill from becoming a law. And Congress has to override with 2/3 of a vote in the House and the Senate. So if the president vetoes something, you need super majorities in both houses to overturn it, which is very, very difficult, especially you can consider that now in the climate we are, probably would never happen to override a veto. President, however, cannot veto an amendment, which is a different process, which we talked about before. Only bills. These are laws proposed by Congress. It's often used as a threat to influence lawmaking. So generally, Congress will try to put forth laws that they know aren't going to be vetoed. That's not always the case. One of the last times the veto has been overridden was the War Powers Resolution, and that was with President Nixon. And what led to that, there was controversy over the Vietnam War, as that was never approved by Congress and had been going on through multiple presidencies. And there was a release of the Pentagon Papers that showed that the President Johnson, as well as Nixon, had been lying about the progress of the war effort. And so Congress and the American people were very upset about that. This was a big thing in the New York Times. And the War Powers Resolution said, no, you can only send troops in for up to 60 days and then 30 days to remove. We discussed this a bit before. Nixon vetoed it, but somehow the two parties came together and the veto was overridden and it became law. So the first presidents, again, this is the first president under the Constitution, George Washington. There were several other in very weak, president role prior to this. But George Washington was the first that we consider because of the Constitution. And he established the primacy of the national government. He was very popular. He was the hero from the Revolutionary War. He was very well respected. When there was the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, when he was president, it was in 4 different states, primarily in Western Pennsylvania. You had several thousand of these farmers who didn't like that there was going to be a federal tax on liquor. Typical Americans we are. And this was a challenge to tariffs and taxes being placed by the federal government. If you remember before, the Articles of Confederation, prior to the Constitution, prior to 1789, the federal government could not put forth any taxes or tariffs, but now they could. So this was, people weren't used to that, and they're saying, no, we're not going to stand for that. And Washington led the troops himself as president. God, imagine the president now doing that on horseback. That'd be good television, that's for sure. And he brought 15,000 federal troops and shut it down. I think Alexander Hamilton was there as well. President Washington established the cabinet system. These are the secretaries for each department of government. There weren't many cabinet positions. They were created by Washington. There was only a few, and we'll discuss that later, the next chapter and onward. So this gave the executive branch teeth. They had personnel and policy advisors, as well as actual staff to make sure that the law is being carried out. Washington also asserted the president's role in foreign affairs. He was the first to serve as commander-in-chief. The president prior to that, again, was a weak role, did not have that authority. John Adams, who was Washington's vice president, he was the second president. Wasn't very popular. We discussed before the Alien and Sedition Act, which was a big loser, and the public hated it. And this really formed these two initial parties. Prior, there was never a thought in the Constitution to have political parties. This was the birth of that, where you had the Federalists who followed Hamilton and Jefferson, and Anti-Federalists who were with Adams. And of course, the Federalists won, and they were against Alien and Sedition Act, which was gotten rid of prior to the election, but the damage was done. After that, Thomas Jefferson, the first Federalist president, and he was there for 2 terms. John Adams was just 1 term. And similar to Washington, he claimed inherent powers we talked about. That's powers belong to the president that are inferred in the Constitution, like implied powers. He doubled the size of the nation through the Louisiana Purchase, which we also talked about briefly, buying the large portion of what's now the United States from France, because they needed money under Napoleon to fight their fruitless effort to take over most of Europe and Asia. Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1837. He's had a little bit of a revival with certain groups, either very positive or very negative, mostly negative. But he was the first populist president. President Trump, when he came into office, first thing he did was put up a picture of Andrew Jackson. At this time, by 1829, most states had removed property ownership requirement for voting, and that was massive, because now it wasn't just the land-owning elite who were voting. Now everyone was voting. Okay, everyone meaning every white male. And he was very loud, brash. He wasn't from aristocracy. He was from a military background. He resonated with the poor and uneducated people. He rewarded loyal Democratic Party followers with presidential appointments. This created what's called the spoils system, which we'll talk about more later. And you will see actually in the next part of this module with chapter 8, there's a video about Andrew Jackson. He used veto power often. However, he was a staunch supporter of slavery. He killed thousands of Native Americans. He forcibly moved them from their homes in Oklahoma, many of whom had helped him in battles prior, and created what was known as the Trail of Tears, just moving, taking the land and moving, many Native American tribes to Oklahoma. So Andrew Jackson, again, had a lot of issues. Abraham Lincoln, of course, 1861 to 1865, he practiced a massive expansion of executive power during the Civil War, which he justified as being necessary to maintain order during this time. Many civil liberties were suspended during this time. He used executive orders and actions without congressional approval to get this done. One of those, however, was the Emancipation Proclamation, and that freed the slaves in the South, and later he won the Civil War, of course. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, 1933 to 45. He came in during the Great Depression, and he put forth, as we read, the New Deal. These were many different programs to increase employment, to build infrastructure, to build housing, help create unions, all of these things that helped average working class and middle class Americans. He also presided as president during most of World War II. And during this process, the executive branch grew massively, not only due to New Deal and Great Depression programs, some things like Social Security, but also through the war. Just the size of government, executive branch does include military. So new departments, agencies sprung up left and right, and the federal bureaucracy grew and really hasn't stopped growing since. FDR was also known for reaching out to the people directly in using the technology of the time. In this case, it was radio broadcasts, and he would have weekly fireside chats where he would speak to the American people, and they were very popular. So, policymaking through executive order. And usually we say executive order or executive action, and this can refer to an actual executive order, an executive memorandum, which serves almost the same as an executive order, or an executive proclamation, such as the Emancipation Proclamation. And they all hold the weight of law. Technically, they're not laws, but they are supposed to only be for the management of government. So it's not that an executive order can come into law and change the Constitution, but what it can do, an executive order or an executive action, can be used to clarify how the executive branch carries out implementation of law. So executive orders were used to end segregation in the military, that was under Truman, and to create affirmative action programs under LBJ. They do not require congressional approval, but Congress can propose a bill to remove an executive order. However, the president can always veto that bill. So that doesn't happen. Executive memorandums and proclamations are similar. Again, Emancipation Proclamation. As far as executive orders, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, had almost 30 or over 3,700 executive orders, the most by far in history. Of course, that was during the Great Depression with the New Deal and major world war. So you're going to have a lot more during those times. Truman is second. I think he's around 900. And if you look at the last two presidents prior to Biden, Obama had 276 over 8 years. Trump had 220 over 4 years. And a lot of executive orders actually, especially in the beginning, so Biden has around 50 now, close to. Usually when a new president comes in, they will send out a flurry of executive orders that override the previous president's executive orders. And as you read in the text, there's the example that was used where, you know, each president, depending on their party, has changed back and forth since the time of Reagan. And this happens all the time. Signing statements, executive actions video, make sure to watch that. It's in module 4. And sometimes you'll also see, as far as a signing statement, a written comment attached to a bill that's signed by the president, just clarifying something of their perspective on that bill. George W. Bush did this. He used statements to ignore affirmative action requirements, whistleblower protections, and safeguards against political bias and research. And a lot of this it sounds really nasty and negative, and in many ways it is, but this was to protect against litigation, potential litigation with some of the actions. But again, watch the video in module 4 on executive actions. So the presidential establishment, and there's many different elements to that. Of course, there's the vice president. Generally, a vice president is chosen to balance the ticket. For example, Kennedy's from Boston, from Massachusetts, rather. He's a Northerner, so he chose Johnson as his vice president, who's a Southerner from Texas. You also see the example, President Trump. This is someone who's on his third marriage and had multiple affairs, and including with adult film stars. So the vice president was Mike Pence, who's an evangelical Christian, who is a Boy Scout in comparison. So there was that balancing of the ticket. This happens pretty much with every election. The vice president presides over the Senate and only votes as a tiebreaker. Used to be more ceremonial roles. You read about what Adams said about it, how inconsequential it was. He wrote letters to his wife when he was vice president under Washington. Though it's increased in power in the modern presidency, probably the most important example of that is under George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney. People would joke that he's the real president. He was the real insider, established Washington politician, knew where all the bodies were buried. And the vice president in this time actually would get the intelligence daily brief first to their office before, and then the vice president office would present it to the president. So that had tremendous power in that setup. The cabinet refers to the secretaries who are the heads of the 15 departments of the executive branch. But the cabinet also includes the vice president. And this cabinet is not directly mentioned in the Constitution, but is implied. The secretary title is heads the executive department. We have 15 now, it'll probably grow in the future. And a director heads a federal agency. And they assist the president in executing laws and making decisions. And in some cases, they're very powerful. In some cases, not. Presidential spouses, the first lady or first gentleman, they're informal advisors. There have been powerful first ladies in the past. Abigail Adams, of course, John Adams' wife, was very powerful. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, that's President Wilson's wife, we mentioned. He had a stroke in 1919, and she was the person that you had to talk to in order to talk to him, even though he couldn't speak. And she would convey what he had said, according to her, to whomever had asked. So she had a lot of power. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the just great statesmen in our history, stateswoman in this case. And while she was first lady, she wrote a newspaper column every week, which is unprecedented even now. And after her work as first lady, she was chosen as the first female United Nations representative. And you have to remember, when this was in the middle of the 20th century, that was a fairly major position. Under President Kennedy, she was put together a council on addressing women's issues, and was always an advocate for many different things, especially those underprivileged groups. We can add first ladies, of course, powerful first ladies, to Hillary Clinton, as she eventually became a senator and ran for president. So presidential establishment continued. You have the Executive Office of the President, the EOP, and FDR established this to oversee many of these New Deal programs and this rapidly expanding executive branch. He wanted people in the White House with him who were advisors, who could work with the cabinet, et cetera, to make sure these things were running smoothly. So that was set up in 39. And now the office also includes other agencies, some of which were set up in 39, some of which came later, some of which, as we read in the text, the names have changed. For example, it was the Bureau of the Budget. Now it's the Office of Management and Budget. You have the Council of Economic Advisors. Of course, you have the Office of Vice President, was moved into this executive office, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and most importantly, the National Security Council. And this is headed by the National Security Advisor. That includes the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State, Treasury, and Defense. That's in the law. And also the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we're going to talk more about this later in the semester. And this also will include, depending on the president's choices, many other people. It could be the director of the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security Secretary, but they have to be approved and cleared to be able to do that. If you remember, under the last president, the couple of family members he wanted to include in the National Security Council, but they couldn't pass the security clearance, so they were not allowed to do so. White House staff You have a chief of staff generally, and they handle all the operations within the White House to make sure things are running smoothly, especially handling the day-to-day schedule of the president. You have many personal assistants and senior aides. These are not subject to Senate confirmation. They have no independent legal authority. They serve at the pleasure of the president, and their power is derived from their personal relationship with the president. Presidential leadership and the importance of public opinion. As we read in the text, the leadership and personality is very important. So the power to persuade is the most important ingredient for a successful president. And as you see, it's a cartoon here that's Theodore Roosevelt, which he used to call his bully pulpit. Now, pulpit obviously is what a minister or priest uses, or someone leading a delegation to speak at the lectern. That's a pulpit. And this is a bully pulpit because they can use it to their advantage. They can speak directly to the American people. And Theodore Roosevelt did that, and he would bypass Congress. He wouldn't work to get Congress's approval as much as he would to gain public support. His nephew, FDR, did this as well with the fireside chats. And then on and on, we've seen it used in many different ways. Technology went from newspapers to radio to television and now social media, as we saw with Trump with the tweeting and lots of other social media uses of that. And president and public opinion, this is something that's been measured for, 50, 60 years. And approval ratings usually impact a president's policy agenda. And generally, there's a cyclical pattern with a honeymoon period after an election. So president's elected and the ratings are going to be higher, and then they steadily decline over time. So Obama, when he came to office, he had a high of 69% approval rating, which is very high in the modern era, and then a low of 38%. And he was around the 40s at the end of his second term. Trump, after his election, had a high of 46%, and then had a low of 34%, which dipped a few different times, but especially at the end of his presidency. The highest recorded, again, this is just in the modern history because this wasn't used 100 years ago, was George W. Bush after 9/11 with 90%, but that declined actually to one of the lowest ever recorded, to 25% near the end of his presidency. So he had the highs and the lows. So Office of Management and Budget, we briefly talked about before, formerly the Bureau of the Budget. They work exclusively for the president. And in Congress, we talked about the Office of Management and Budget was looked on as could be too possibly biased, should be biased towards whichever president is in power. So the Congress set up their own Congressional Budget Office, CBO, for them. So they have two different groups. They're checking on each other as far as looking at the budget, forecasts, etc., analyses, all of that stuff. There's hundreds of economic and budget experts with OMB. They prepare the president's budget for Congress. They review agency budgets, and they create economic forecasts. And again, in tandem, Congress will also, the Congressional Budget Office will review the president's budget, review agency budgets as well, and create their own economic forecasts. In the Congressional Budget Office, despite the bickering in Congress, is pretty objective and nonpartisan. Presidents may propose legislation, and this especially began with FDR, as we talked about, where the president had all of these things when he came into office with the New Deal he put forth, and had, I think, 70 plus different laws passed through Congress quickly to address the Great Depression. Now, they can propose a bill, but they can't introduce it officially. So they can propose a bill and then Congress takes control. And we talked about it last time, how it has to go through all of those different gyrations through committees, etc., to get to the floor to a vote. As it mentioned in the text, it's important to propose legislation early in the term. You're taking advantage of that honeymoon period, and you're also taking advantage of it's not an election year until the second year when you have midterms. So to get those things early to try to get them through. And the role, of course, of party loyalty and having a majority in Congress is paramount to success. And that is it for today. We're a little bit of a shorter lecture, but we'll be back with chapter 8. Make sure to watch the videos, and especially watch the videos in chapter 8. There's the piece on Andrew Jackson.